Dr. Mark Changizi here with your Science Moment. Today I'm going to talk about the rush away from all of those who supported lockdowns. So many of those are now saying, oh look, I never supported lockdowns, and I'm not going to try to go through the full gamut. There's others that have put together nice montages of folks who were panicked and supporting lockdowns, demanding them of their politicians, calling others deniers, and now are out there saying, hey, I was arguing against lockdowns, and I can't believe these folks were pushing for them. So here's just one example is Dan Wootton, sort of famous in the UK, not really well known here. This is something that he wrote March 23rd of 2020. Time has come to stop talk of social distancing and make it abundantly clear what we have to do as a nation. Stay at home or suffer the consequences. Our lack of collective action is goading the Prime Minister into taking more draconian steps to abolish normal life. So in other words, if you don't do this draconian thing, well, our Prime Minister is going to do even more draconian things. It's no spring break. This was a little bit 3 days earlier. This is the worst I've ever felt. Like I've been hit by a truck concerning what it's like, paints a grim picture of what it's like to get coronavirus. He was left unable to move, slept for 23 hours a day, and didn't eat for a week during this terrifying ordeal. All right, so over-exaggerating it here. He's talking on March 20th of 2020. I went head-to-head with co-editor of Conservative Woman Laura Perrins, who wrote that she refuses to cower like a dog in a kennel by self-isolating because she'd rather die as a free-born citizen. But what about the others she's putting at risk? Again, this idea that anybody who's behaving normally, socializing normally, going about daily life normally is a killer. An anonymous whistleblower at one of the UK's top supermarkets, this is March 28th, paints a disturbing picture of what's going on behind the scenes, claiming delivery drivers have no gloves or masks and are not social distancing. That's so horrible, right? So this same fella, Dan Wootton, and I don't have a great picture of him historically, but 7 hours ago, concerning Rishi Sunak's lockdown mea culpa, which I'll show you how the UK leader has sort of backed down from his earlier position or said more information about his real position all along, and he was really against it. So this same fella, Dan Wootton, says he allowed skeptics like me to be dismissed as crackpots. Now he admits the public was kept in the dark with fear messaging, empowering the scientists and not talking about the trade-offs. A shameful dereliction of duty. Well, while that's true, it was a shameful dereliction of duty, given that you're a leader in the media, a journalist, you were yourself just as much a fearmonger as were the politicians that you're complaining about. So we also have two stories that came out recently. The British press seems to be ahead of the American press on coming to a full understanding of the lack of appreciation that there had to be a cost-benefit analysis, not just a benefit analysis, which is what in fact happened worldwide. In the Telegraph, bravo to the lockdown skeptics who were smeared and dismissed for daring to defend freedom. And in The Spectator, the lockdown files, Rishi Sunak on what we weren't told. Just a short excerpt. When Britain was being locked down, the country was assured that all risks had been properly and robustly considered. After all, it wasn't as if they would lock us down without seriously weighing up the consequences, was it? And of course it was. As they go on to recount here, there really were no cost-benefit analyses done at all. It was grand mal killing. It was grubby, money-loving people that would consider a cost-benefit analysis back in March and April of 2020. That was the attitude across almost every intelligent person when this mass hysteria swept through. So now some of these folks, and you can go on and on about these folks that are now realizing and then trying to cover over. I don't think they're even consciously covering over. They've just created this narrative in their own head, forgetting about the old stuff or minimizing their old positions, because at some point they changed and now they feel like they hadn't done, and even Fauci himself says, oh, I didn't ever encourage lockdowns. Of course he did. I think these people often are even lying to themselves, which is the best way to lie because you're very convincing when you can do that. Now, a lot of these people are trying to sometimes say, well, given what we knew at the time, since then we found that lockdowns, in fact, don't have any correlation with pandemic severity. The greater intervention stringency does not correlate with pandemic severity. There's no correlation worldwide showing that they ever, in fact, help. And there's tremendous evidence that they have both called drastic economic harm, as well as massive developing world harm, which we've gone through in earlier moments, as well as a specific lockdown related and hurried deaths of many multidimensional kinds, of which I've pointed out before, but not fully covered like I have it on Twitter. But the idea that they were ever common sense and something to do in the absence of any good information is ridiculous. First of all, the precautionary principles, given this is something that we never did, we never locked down whole healthy populations, then the precautionary principles should have told you that no, we never would do this without the onus would be on the person supposing that one should do this, whether it's for masks or any of these interventions. But in fact, common sense, it was never that case. So what I'm really aiming to do here is to talk through that and also talk through back in March when I was arguing against the lockdown. So these aren't common sense. There's nothing rational. This is all a panicked, hysterical, irrational drive to do lockdowns, to do something, right? And I summarized the arguments that I've been making in March on April 27th. And these were all arguments, the arguments that as I'm presenting here were arguments that we even had in March, and I was only summarizing them in April. So let me just quickly go through this little thread here. I just want to walk through it. Again, this is April 27th of 2020. Lockdowns were not common sense measures. They were hysterical reactions out of fear. Here are 15 of just some of the reasons why it was not common sense. And I'm not including all the reasons we have now being April 2020, not to mention now 2.5 years later. I'm not including all the reasons we have now to see they were a bad idea, because even by then, the data had already started to roll in. There was no correlations between intervention stringency and pandemic severity already then. There was already good data that there was no help, and job economic harms were already rolling in strongly. All right, the first of these 15. Evidence was poor that COVID-19 was doomsday in the first place. The infection fatality rate was low. The transmittability the R0 value was around 2.3, not ridiculously high, kind of in the same general range as flu. There was nothing to get super frightened about. The age distribution, vaguely broadly similar to flu, a little bit steeper than flu. It hits mostly those with significant comorbidities. Those were the people that it was taking out, which is on average age of 80. In fact, it's safer for the young than it was for flu. And this was just showing the broad demographic differences for both flu and for COVID-19. And you can see they're broadly similar. Right. 2. Literature review prior to COVID-19 had little good to say about it. And this is one of these massive WHO sort of book-like documents going through all of the different ways that you should handle a pandemic and talking about lockdowns, which is a term, and it was recommended over and over again that this is not something that one would really ever want to do. Right? So this was not standard practice within epidemiology. It had never been done. And suddenly, it became something that everybody had to do, and it copycatted all around the world. 3, almost no awareness of the impact on civil rights. As if emergency declaration suspension of rights, house arrest, mass unemployment, and business shutdowns is just something democratic governments sometimes do. No, this is not something governments just sometimes do. They never do this kind of thing. Outside of actual, real, war, out of wartime measures, you would never see anything like this. 4, there was no historical precedent for putting the entire healthy population in quarantine. Never before. Yet this was suddenly common sense. 5, And you might be wondering why it says Mark Changizi lobotomized. Well, since I've been, through 5 or 6 progressively worse and Twitter suspensions of various kinds, as well as more than a year of deboosting, pretty sure my last one, any one that I get next, I'll be out permanently. So I'm having to just stay quiet. I can't say certain kinds of things at all anymore. Number 5, there are broad classes of physical distancing and other measures that can slow down infection spread, including organic responses from governmental urgings, shopping times for those with comorbidities, greater cleaning, etc. And nothing is obvious about which one works best. That is, there were other things people could do. There was just better circulation, better ventilation, opening windows, having different kinds of people with comorbidities. We know who they are, so there's ways of potentially giving them times to go to the store where no one else is there. A few hours way before, just open it up for them so they can leave, and hopefully there's enough ventilation so that they're a much lower likelihood of getting the respiratory virus. None of these things were talked about. It was just, it has to be lockdowns, the most severe possible thing of all. Number 6, even if lockdowns in principle work, do real humans follow them sufficiently well that it remains better than other measures? Not obvious. The first thing that you learn as a psychologist trying to do psychology experiments is that no matter how simple the task, even just looking at some illusion and saying how big or how small it is, people do their own thing. It's almost impossible to get people to do what you want them to do. And in large numbers, that's almost impossible. So when you engage in society level psychological experiments, so to speak, then one of the first questions that you have to ask is, even if this thing worked in principle, if we were sufficiently draconian that we could drag people around like SimCity, then maybe it would work. But since you can't actually drag them around like little avatars in SimCity, what do real people do under these circumstances? Do they in fact follow the guidances? What actually happens with real complicated human beings? This is one of the first questions that you have to ask if you're going to engage in these kinds of draconian interventions, even if you don't care about civil liberties. 7, was the infection even discovered early enough that lockdowns would make much of a difference, even supposing lockdowns worked? And of course, the answer is almost certainly no. By the time it spread around sufficiently such that enough people got sick, such that they ended up at hospital, such that it ended up being news broadcast and had enough pressure to suddenly get everybody bouncing as one to say, let's do lockdowns, you can be sure that it's so well spread at this point, you cannot stop it. All right? By the time you know about it, it's too late. It's months and months too late. And since then, we've got evidence that it was even floating around, even in the United States, back in September, if I recall, almost 6 months earlier, before lockdowns was a term that anyone had ever heard of. Number 8, might lockdowns handicap society on reaching herd immunity? And is this good or bad? That is, ultimately the way out of this, and ultimately the way to protect the vulnerable, those that are typically in their 80s or those with high comorbidities, is to get all the healthy people, the young people who have almost no risk, very low risk, their flu-like level risks 0.1%, much lower than 0.1% if you're under 30 and so forth, is to get that entire population, they've already gotten sick. Once they're sick, they're recovered, now you have herd immunity. It's not spreading within the community anymore. And you want to have that happen as quickly as possible, because then it frees up those with comorbidities to resume life safely. Right? The longer that you spread it out and make it more slowly that it takes for the whole population to get immunity, then these people are just trapped in their quarantine forever, even if you wanted to try to quarantine the highly vulnerable. And they don't want to be quarantined forever in their old folks' home. And it just increases the risks, because they're still interacting with nurses, they're still interacting with family, which they want to do and they need to do. So it just increases the risks to those for which this is risky. Number 9, nor is it common sense that lockdowns, even if they handle the infection risks better than other measures, are best when the economic consequences are included. The economic consequences are not common sense. They are devastating, including health and quality of life. And these are the kinds of things I try to cover, these kinds of broad scale consequences, economic consequences. When you break the machine, which is a self-organized machine, and you have 50 million people out of work, and you've got hundreds of thousands of businesses that are out of business forever in the United States alone, so millions worldwide, the amount of misery and the amount of deaths that follow from this over the years is going to be tremendous. And none of these things were calculated. Number 10, lockdowns can lead to people not seeking medical attention, raising mortality in other areas of medicine. In fact, we've seen this over and over again. The number of non-COVID related deaths that occur at home, the number of at-home deaths spiked, went very high after the lockdowns happened. People were so frightened, they didn't even go to the hospital anymore. They were either too frightened to go to the hospital or too frightened to be a problem at the hospital, because the hospitals are supposedly all packed, so I'll stay here and be a good citizen, and then they die at home. Right? Number 11, lockdowns and the resultant economic downturn and loneliness can lead to depression, greater domestic abuse, alcoholism. Is it common sense that these are worth it? There's nothing obvious about it. What I'm pointing, when I'm saying there's nothing obvious about it, really, it takes a complicated cost-benefit analysis to decide what are the likely amounts of this, supposing we're setting civil liberties aside, what are the likely amounts of this problem, the depression and psychological issues, as well as all the other things that are piling up on this side of the seesaw of the weight, the balance system, versus minimizing COVID on the other side. These things have to be included, and it's not obvious. You can't just say, oh, well, it's more important to have zero COVID. None of these other things matter. No, you can't just say that. Number 12, lockdowns lower everyone's immune system. Does this make everyone more prone to any infection once they come out? Supposing that people were really locked down, stayed at home for a month at a time, 2 months, many months at a time, you're no longer being exposed constantly as you typically are. You're exposed to viruses every day. There's things that are just floating through the air. You're being exposed to lots of different viruses in small amounts. Part of why we have the immunity that we have and that we are not sick most of the time is because we're constantly being exposed and we're developing immunity, and our body is able to learn our immune system is able to learn these different kinds of ways to defend itself by virtue of these exposures. So I don't know the answer to this, but that has to be part of the calculus. Number 13, lockdowns confine people together, and nearly all infections happen in such situations. Not from grocery stores, not from restaurants, not from parks, etc. The mean reproduction number in such situations can be much higher. That is, the number of people that you transmit to is almost always very high when you're living in close spaces with others. That's where all the transmission happens. It's not happening at restaurants and parks and all of these places. You're shutting down this world, and you're shutting down the entire world where I could go, and you're forcing me into a household. Well, I'm guaranteed if I'm spending more time at the household to now spread it more easily amongst those in the household. Right? And it doesn't mean that it's just going to be confined to the household, because here's number 14. Members of extended families tend to interact even during lockdowns. But because extended families overlap other extended families in a network, infection continues to spread. This could mean lockdowns worsen things. Common sense doesn't tell us whether it's faster or not. That is, my family, let's say we've got 6 people all living in one house, and if I get it, because I'm definitely spending a lot more time at home, they're all getting it. And it's not like we're just a bubble. No, we still going to go see my sister, let's say, and in our extended family, we try to pretend that we're a bubble. But of course, my sister will have her husband, and well, they're going to see that these things still spread, and they spread just a little bit more slowly. It just slows the rate by which it spreads through society, because it's still a connected network. Number 15, and this to me is one of the biggest ones of all, the greatest low-risk black swan danger, and what I'm referring to here is Nassim Taleb's sort of rare, but not so rare that you can just avoid it, is a black swan. The greatest low-risk black swan dangers for humans are the stuff other humans do. That is, he would point out the pandemic, a great, evil, awful pandemic that's going to really overturn the world through its, how dangerous it is to our bodies, is a black swan. It's something that we really have to take seriously, and if it happens, we have to overturn society. It justifies overturning society because it's so awful when it happens. But you know what? The real awful things that actually happen, rarely but sufficiently often that we have dozens of them every century, are the stuff that humans do to others. They're democides, genocides. So let me just start again. The greatest low-risk black swan dangers for humans are the stuff other humans do. Riots, revolutions, wars, human-induced famine, and so on. Democides and genocides. Playing with civil rights en masse while devastating the economy, what could go wrong? Right? And so it was never common sense, the idea that we do lockdowns. It was obvious in March. In February, it was even more obvious you would never do lockdowns. That was standard practice, not doing lockdowns. Don't let anybody tell you now that, okay, I was for lockdowns in the beginning because, and they come up with some story why it was common sense, received wisdom. It wasn't received wisdom. It was a meme that was going through, and it became a righteous meme, and anybody who was a good person had to repeat the mantra, and then came to believe the mantra that we should lock down. That's what good people do. And when somebody says, look, lockdown doesn't make sense, they're the out group. We were the unclean out group. We were the deniers. We were hated. We were attacked. And I'm still on the outs. I mean, I've mentioned this before. Our book doesn't get covered in any mainstream media because nearly every journalist, except for Alex Berenson, who of course was more attacked than almost anybody, every journalist, like sheep, all said the exact same thing. We have to lock down. These people are evil for suggesting otherwise. This was not due to some considered rational calculation about what to do. It was not that kind of thing at all. It was something that is only caused by these psychosocietal forces that we discuss here on my Science Moment channel, and that our FreeX Research Institute studies. And the first, what I've had pinned to the top of my Twitter since March 17th, all of my first tweets trying to push back hysteria were on March 10th. My pinned tweet gets at this point of the real origins of the arguments for lockdowns and then masks and then vaccine mandates and all of these different kinds of things is summarized by this tweet, which is still pinned to this day, which is the moral of this is when we were calling it coronavirus 19 still. The moral of coronavirus 19 will be that social contagion via social networks is more dangerous than biological contagion. And that's always been the case, and that will always be the case. And that was your Science Moment.